I'm Bob Pyhl. I'm a writer and a freelance biologist. I live in Grays River, which is a tributary of the lower Columbia River.
Robert, what do you think you may take away from this gathering, this encounter with the mountain and this recovering landscape that would contribute to your work somehow?
Well, I'm taking away something that's very physical and concrete, and something else which is less so. I have two strong connections to this landscape. I've written a book about the area immediately east of us, within a very few miles, called the Dark Divide, Washington's biggest unprotected wild area. It's a book about Bigfoot and about encounter with the magnificent and ancient and very powerful traditions of Sasquatch among the Native Americans and among our modern culture. It has to do with the idea that if the land becomes so tame that we can no longer even imagine the idea of something like Bigfoot, then we've lost something profound, whether or not Bigfoot ever walked. But I've also written books and spent a lot of time concerned with butterflies. And I've studied the distribution of Washington butterflies for a long time, and they often enter my poems, my fiction, and my essays. And just the other day, our first day here, I noticed that a plant that I've been seeking, especially this season, for which there are only 2 records in the Washington State Herbarium, was absolutely proliferating along the roadsides and up some of the pumice plain valleys of this monument. And I was completely unaware of that, and there's a special butterfly connected with that plant that I've been seeking. I found it on the plant, which is exciting both because it's many, many miles west of where it's ever been found before, west of the Cascade Crest for the first time, which perhaps only a few of us care about. But it's also exciting because it means not only did this rare Washington plant survive the blast and then proliferate in the aftermath, but a butterfly that is specifically attuned to living on that plant also survived in this outpost. And it gave me a much stronger realization of the resilience of the system under this enormous alteration of the eruption. So that's the concrete thing I'm taking away, a better understanding as a biologist of what this episode in Mount St. Helens life has meant for the plants and animals here. And then the more abstract, less concrete thing I think that I'm taking away, well, I haven't tried to put this in words yet, so I may mumble a bit, but the idea, I think, that the dimension of the landscape is greater. The dimensions are more than perhaps I realized. I've been deep into the Dark Divide, back and forth and crossing around, and I don't know it well, but I know it enough to know that there's much more there than I can possibly grasp or even ask. But at Mount St. Helens, many of us tended to paint it in a kind of a monotone, and I don't mean just because the landscape was a monotone of pumice and down trees on Spirit Lake. We have that image in our minds. But also something of a monotone of our thinking about it, many of us who haven't worked up here very much, because probably of that term blast zone. And many of us, even biologists, geologists who hadn't been here very much, have tended to think of it as almost an eraser across script on a blackboard, and you're starting from scratch. Those who have worked here in depth have shown us that that's very much different from the actual facts on the ground, that so much more did in fact survive and inoculate the further growth and evolution here. But what that means to me, a person who has spent some time up here both before and after the 1980 eruption, is that if the biological dimensions are so much greater here after the blast than we knew, then what about all the other dimensions here? What about the, yes, spiritual dimensions, but also the dimensions of imagination that goes far beyond a butterfly that I can catch and show to people and then release and then put a dot on a map that butterfly occurred here. That's a fact. But what about the things that are not so easily encapsulated in fact? What about the way in which the black caddisflies hatching at Meta Lake inform the Vox's swifts that are flying out of the snag to feed on them, and both of them refract into our eyes and our minds and our imagination in ways that we can't possibly even measure at this point? And this could proliferate through every species that's coming back here, and through every shift of wind and shift of air, and every scent and every mood of the mountain. So the first night when we were here, we came up onto this ridge, and Mount St. Helens in the alpenglow that lit Mount Adams and then Mount St. Helens all of a sudden became a cotton candy factory. I mean, this cotton candy, pink steam and ash clouds were issuing out of the crater as if it were a new eruption of pink wool or candy floss. That's kind of a lame simile for it, but that's what it looked like. Well, who had ever thought of the mountain that way before? I hadn't. But then that night the clouds descended, the rain came down, our tents were all a little too exposed, and the next morning was cold and blowing and very wet, and the mountain wasn't even there. And when it next came back that afternoon, it was with a very different visage than we'd seen the night before in the cotton candy factory in the alpenglow. And today, again, it's different. So that's what I mean by the mood of the mountain. Every one of those moods has implications for all the lives here as well, both the more than human lives and how they grow and how they live and how they will continue to reproduce and evolve. But to the lives of these upright apes, you know, there might be the upright ape of Sasquatch over there in the Dark Divide, but we know that this species of upright ape is here. We are here. And how we are bent and changed and refracted and buffed and scraped and in every way worked by the mountain is far deeper and far subtler and far more various than I ever could have imagined prior to this trip. I think, for example, of all the trees down in Spirit Lake, and that image is deeply disturbing to some, and to others it's those trees entering the great stew, the great compost of the land, and it's actually an inspiriting and a sort of a happy, almost happy. Happy is probably not an appropriate word, but there's a future to those trees that's different from what it was when they were growing. But to some it's disturbing, and to some it's a more emollient sort of a view. But I had a thought about those trees lying in Spirit Lake the other day that I've never had, which is that they're being scraped and adzed and cut and shaped by the wind and water as if they were so many supine totems that may be raised again in a new eruption, or may simply settle into the fundament as the totems do in the Queen Charlotte Islands. When they rot, that's such a word that's misused or given a negative context, but rot is simply the preface for growth. It's the antecedent of life, and it's necessary. So when these trees in that great mass on the water, every one is receiving a different face and a different set of characters and character from the wind and the water and the pumice and the ash that grinds them and forms them and shapes them, so that they all have personality prior to re-entering the stream of nitrogen and carbon and the other constituents. So I guess I would say, Mike, that this experience has allowed me to look at this astonishing mountain, which I've loved for many, many years, in a way that I find humbling, in a way that makes me feel my imagination is still alive. And as a biologist, makes me know that all we can possibly know and all we can possibly ask is only a preface to the book that could be written that